Miracles. Can we believe in miracles? 2019 in the Western world. Well, let me just remind, haven't I put it on? Okay. I recently found out that there is an Indian bear called The View from Nowhere. Interesting name of a bear. That originally comes from a very important book, that title, A View from Nowhere, of Thomas Nagel, underlining that every person speaks out from a certain position with certain assumptions, certain presupposition. No one has this pure reason or this pure understanding. But in our search for truth, we will always have a certain starting point, and we will always be shaped by a number of things around us. That is very much so when you look into the criticism of the belief in miracles in the Western world. In the late 1600s, this handsome young man, Isaac Newton, made those revolutionary discoveries about nature and could formulate a number of laws about how nature functions. And this led to a new understanding of the world we are a part of. So people started to talk about the clockwork universe, the universe as a clock, which just function according to certain laws. And I'm even quoting from Wikipedia here. This idea was very popular amongst deists during the Enlightenment, when Isaac Newton derived his laws of motion and showed that alongside the law of universal gravitation, they could explain the behavior of both terrestrial objects and the solar system. So into our culture comes a new understanding of a much more clock-like universe. And not long after that, David Hume comes along. And it's impossible to understand David Hume if you don't see him from this perspective. This is the new, fresh, attractive perspective, the clockwork universe, that he is a cultural child of. And then he starts to think, but it's not a thinking from nowhere. It's a very biased thinking out from this new perception of the universe. And he then writes his very famous book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in that book, he comes to this very, what should we say, strong and somewhat arrogant conclusion. I flatter myself. By the way, that is a statue of David Hume from Edinburgh. I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures. And he flatters himself of having formulated a kind of final argument against miracles. And he thinks this argument will stand for eternity. He was partially true. It stood for almost 200 years. Very impressive to formulate an argument that seriously had been discussed for so long time and shaped the understanding of the whole Western world to a very high degree for almost 200 years. But not any longer. So, as long as the world endures, that's not true. The argument is rapidly falling apart. But before we look into his argument and why it is not a valid argument, let us do some thinking about what he was criticizing. He was criticizing the Christian understanding that there is a supernatural realm and that God has acted supernaturally into this world. So he's criticizing really the foundation of the Christian faith. So let's do some thinking about what does the Christian faith claims about the miraculous? The first thing I would like to underline is that from a Christian perspective, both nature, this universe, and the supernatural is related to God. It's not that we have an independent nature and then you have a separate sphere, the supernatural, but God has created this world. He has created a spiritual realm with angels and so on, and he himself is the ultimate reality. God is related to every aspect of reality. The laws of nature, which Isaac Newton described, is describing one way God is working. And it's equally God's work with the natural as it is with the supernatural. It's not more God when it's supernatural, if we use those terms, than when it's natural. So when we have food on the table, there's nothing supernatural, but the process that we receive food. We give thanks to God because behind all those natural cause and effect change stands God, who has created them and is upholding them. And when Jesus were feeding the 5,000, in a miraculous way, people gave praise to God for the food they were receiving. It's the same God, and it's equally as much God in both ways. Of course, we are more stirred up when confronted with miracles because it's more unusual, but it's not more God. It's just another way of God interacting in this world. Miracles are absolutely foundational to Christianity. We believe that God has acted in a miraculous way into this universe, revealing himself and acting in this world and speaking, interpreting his own acts. And if we just limit it to our view to some of the really big things, of course we believe that creation is a supernatural act, God bringing the whole universe into existence. And then from that point, upholding it and working through all the natural processes. And then everything we confess about Christ is related to the supernatural, the incarnation, that he had no human father, but was born of a virgin. His life, where he supernaturally could prove his own claims of being divine by all the miraculous deeds he did. And of course, in the resurrection, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And we as Christians, we are eagerly awaiting the most dramatic supernatural event ever in world history, which is, of course, the return of Christ, which is a supernatural event, which will be followed by the resurrection of everyone that has ever lived on planet Earth and belongs to humanity. That's a supernatural event. Lazarus was dead for 4 days and was raised. We think that is wow. Jesus was dead for 3 days and was not only raised, but glorified. We are waiting for an event when millions will be raised from the dead and millions will be glorified. And then God will recreate heaven and earth and establish his kingdom forever. So, you take away the supernatural from Christianity, you have no Christianity whatsoever left. So this is really foundational for us. What is a miracle? If we, from a Christian point of view, try to define what is a miracle, we can have an interesting discussion about those natural events that have a unique timing. Should we call them miracles? They seem to be described so in the Bible. Things, for example, of events surrounding Exodus. Most of those events are not supernatural in themselves, but are natural events with an extraordinary timing. So think of the plagues. Well, it was normal insects and normal tragedies, normal phenomenon of nature, but with this specific timing as a result of Pharaoh's revolting against God. Or think of the parting of the Red Sea. It was a wind, nothing supernatural. A wind blowing away water happens many times. Should we call that a miracle? Yeah, I think it was a miracle in the sense of the timing, a supernatural timing of a natural event. But leave that. Let's look at what's obvious a miracle, where the supernatural is, there is a supernatural intervention into our world. How should we describe that? Here is a possible definition. A miracle is an event where God makes a temporary exception or addition to the order of nature as a sign for us. So with this I mean it's temporary. It does not interfere with the general regularity of nature. Nature continues to function the way it always functions. So it's a very temporary, very in time limited exception or addition. God adds something to the natural world, which is not grounded in nature. So therefore it's not a natural event, but it's something happening with nature as God interacts with the creation that comes from him, that he upholds, and he then adds something into that. The miracle is happening against the background of order. It is detectable for us because of the order and regularity of nature. So it suddenly stands out as something else. And we couldn't identify a miracle if it wasn't for this regularity of nature. And it's God that is the cause of this event. It's a direct action from God compared to what we could call God's more indirect actions through the kind of secondary causation in nature. To quote the wonderful book by C.S. Lewis, Miracles, it is therefore inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the law of nature. And he then takes some example and he ends with the virgin birth. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take it over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws. And 9 months later, a child is born. So God adds something into nature and immediately nature takes over. So, what is then Hume saying that has affected so much understanding in our culture, has affected so much theology? This is the background for liberal theology. You can read it in his book, chapter 10. You can find the book on the net. You can read it for free. And it's actually quite readable. And you should read chapter 10, which is on miracles, one of the most famous classical texts on this subject. So that you can easily study it for yourself. It's not that many pages. And he's not as well structured as if William Lane Craig would have written it. So he bounces back and forth between a number of arguments. But basically, you can say he's formulating two different kinds of critique when it comes to miracles. So he says there are two reasons no sound person today can believe in miracles. And the first is an epistemological critique. That we believe in miracles because of testimonies. People tell us, wow, this happened, it must be God. And the disciples tell us, wow, we met Jesus alive. God raised him from the dead. So we believe on testimonies. But this is a problem. And Hume gives us at least 4 different arguments why we should not believe in testimonies about miracles. The first is the falsehood possibility. We know that witnesses can give a false testimony. Maybe they are lying, or maybe they themselves have misunderstood what they thought to be a miracle, but which actually have a natural explanation. So there is always a possibility that a testimony is false. Secondly, of course, we generally can trust when people tell things, but we need to take into account the temptation we as human beings have to just be surprised by wonder. Something unexpected happens. And then we lose our critical ability and we start to wonder. And so many of the religious legends has this as its background. Something that had caused wonder, strong feelings within the human being, has misled those persons to describe it as a miracle, even though it's not. Thirdly, he speaks as a very arrogant Englishman about the primitive and barbarous people who tells about miracles. So is that we need to be aware of that most stories about miracles come from people who are ignorant, not very sophisticated, who are simple-minded. They are easily misled in their understanding of nature. They are trapped within their own limited education and sophistication. And fourthly, the religious competition. If you start to listen to testimonies about miracles, you will find all religions are claiming, wow, here was a miracle that confirms our belief. But then those beliefs contradict each other. So it cannot all miracles cannot be be something that proves a religion. So they cancel out each other. So that is basically the four arguments Hume is giving us. And his conclusion is along these lines. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. It's always much more likely that there's something wrong with the testimony than that the miracle has happened. It's always more reasonable to questioning the testimony than to accept the miracle. And he is very practical. He says like this: for never in all history has a miracle been attested by, and then he gives criteria for testimony. A sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education and learning as to guarantee that they aren't deluded. Of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of wanting to deceive others. Of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have much to lose if they were found to have told a falsehood. And at the same time testifying to events, the reported miracle, that they occurred in such a public manner and in such a famous part of the world as to make the detection of any falsehood unavoidable. All these conditions must be satisfied if we are able to be completely confident of the testimony of men. We'll soon come back to this. So his conclusion is, therefore we may establish it as a maxim that no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle, and make it a just foundation for any system of religion. And we see here this goes at the heart of Christianity, which is built around the resurrection of Jesus, witnessed by a group of people. So he has just killed Christianity, just made Christian faith absolutely impossible. If his reasoning is true, no one should be a Christian. I've read text to you from the 1700, David Hume, but this is really in the academic world today, especially amongst liberal theologians. Here's Bart Ehrman, one of the most famous New Testament critics and most famous critics of Christianity. Here is how he phrased it, and you can hear the echo of David Hume. This is from his book, How Jesus Became God. Any other scenario, besides a miracle, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability, or else we wouldn't call it a miracle. So you see, this is the basis of liberal theology. We can't believe in miracles. Now, amongst philosophers, this kind of reasoning is falling apart for a number of reasons. Here are a few of them. All probability arguments are dependent on the background of a context. When you try to make a judgment, is this totally improbable or not? It depends on the background knowledge of that situation. You cannot make just general statements. What is the probability for me to meet a Swedish speaker when I go abroad? Well, it's a very low probability. We are a small language, a small nation. But if the background knowledge is that when the country I go abroad to is Finland or Minnesota in the US, suddenly the probability is much, much, much higher because part of the Finnish population is Swedish-speaking and a huge number of Swedes were immigrants to the state of Minnesota in the US. So if you have that background information, suddenly probabilities changes. You cannot have this just general discussing of probabilities. And moreover, we are justified sometimes to believe the highly improbable if there are good evidence for that. So you can not only look if it's probable or improbable in a general sense, you have to look for the specific evidences. So you have to distinguish between adding evidence and weighing evidence. So, for example, the number of dead is much greater than the number raised from the dead, so far at least. So the number of dead is much greater than the number of people raised from the dead. But that is not an argument against the resurrection of Christ. You have to investigate into the evidence. The Big Bang is highly improbable. But there are good evidence for it. That's why scientists today say this highly improbable event took place. Because specific evidence is pointed in that points in that direction. Now, let's go back here to this one. I assume you believe in the resurrection of Christ and in the testimony of the apostles. So discuss the criteria Hume gives us why we never can trust the kind of evidences we have for the resurrection. Okay, so in twos or threes, what would be your response to David Hume's criteria for testimonies? Yeah, that's interesting. He's not discussing this specific, relating this list of criteria to the resurrection, because a sufficient number, obviously the resurrection passes that criteria. And education, well, that's a kind of ambiguous criteria. A very elitist approach, and the resurrection witnesses are, as you said, there's a variety of people. Paul, really a learned man, today compared by and to write to Socrates in terms of intellectual abilities. So that's not a very sharp criteria to use. That's very interesting with the outcome, and you can say he talks about they have much to lose if they were found out to have told a falsehood, but you can turn that the other way around. What did they win by proclaiming this lie? And we know they were willing to give their lives for their testimony. So they seems really to be people with integrity, which is what he is actually asking for here. They need to be people with real integrity. That is true. There's a lot of incoherences, and it's interesting to think of David Hume as an empiricist, and he's not very interested in the evidences. So there are incoherences on many levels in this world-famous philosopher's thinking, which is interesting. Yeah, and you can see his Eurocentrism in demanding it must happen in such a public manner, in such a famous part of the world, as to make it the detection of any falsehood unavoidable. Actually, Jerusalem was much more famous place in the world than Edinburgh at the time of the miracle. Jerusalem held one of the 7 wonders of the world of antiquity, the temple. So that was really a public, well-known place. So it's a strange kind of reasoning he's employing here. Okay, so I think on the epistemological critique, David Hume is actually very, very weak. And if we go on to the other form of critique, that explains why he is so weak when he's formulating the epistemological critique, and that is, if we move to Hume's ontological critique of miracles, we can see that he has presuppositions that has excluded miracles from the beginning, so he knows, without investigating into any evidences, that miracles cannot happen. That's why his reasoning is so sloppy in terms of epistemology in testing evidences, because he knows already the answer. He has no need for looking really into the concrete evidences for the miracles in the Christian faith. So he says, and this is a very famous or infamous part of his text, the miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and because of firm and unalterable experience, has established these laws. The case against the miracle is, just because it is a miracle, as complete as any argument from experience can possible be imagined to be. So he knows that in the whole history of the universe, there is an unalterable experience, that the natural laws have there's never been what he calls a violation, or what we would call an addition to the natural law. He knows that from the beginning. So of course there is no room for miracles. A critique from a Christian point of view here would be that we would say, we know today there is order in nature, there's laws of nature, we have no problem with that. We affirm it. As Christians, actually, we expect it. God is a God of order. But science can only describe those laws for us, but it cannot answer the question, is there anything more in nature? Is there anything more than what these laws describes? Our knowledge of nature does not preclude the existence of the supernatural and the supernatural acting into the natural world. And I used to take a very simple illustration, since I come from the Nordic countries and we are moving towards winter, and we know natural law tells us that when the temperature falls below 0, water freezes and we have ice. But if you add something, for example, movement in water, you can have a hole in the ice with water that does not turn into ice, because you add something into the situation, namely movement, and then the water is not freezing. Now, of course, you add something within the natural realm, so it's not a perfect analogy, but it's an analogy saying that you have natural laws, and in this case, they say water freezes when the temperature goes below 0. But you can then add something which does not destroy the natural laws, but for that moment, it adds something to the situation. So water does not freeze temporarily as long as you are moving the water around. Francis Schaeffer has given us, I think, this very good way of summarizing the situation. The universe is, according to Christian faith, an open system of cause and effect. It's a system of cause and effect. Natural sciences can describe that system, but it is an open system where God can interact into the system, and actually we, as human beings, can also transcend the system of cause and effect. So we have a certain amount of freedom. The naturalist perspective is a closed system of cause and effect. And that is actually what Hume has accepted before he starts his investigation into miracles. He has accepted the closed system of cause and effect. And he is, for all practical reasons, a naturalist. And therefore he is forced by his presuppositions to come to the conclusion he is given to us. And it's surprising to read this chapter because he's such a critical philosopher, and then he has a lot of very sloppy statements where his assumptions just comes through. So he can say, but the dead man's coming to life would be a miracle because that has never been observed in any age or country. He just knows that. So of course he knows that stories in the Old Testament, they are not true. Stories in the Gospels are not true. And by the way, there are other stories about people coming to life. And he's not really discussing this issue. He just knows that it has not happened. Because it cannot happen, and therefore it has not happened. So it's a very specific kind of reasoning. If you want to study this from a more philosophical point of view, Bart Ehrman has written an interesting critique of Hume. Hume's Abject Failure is the book, if you want a systematic philosophical critique of this. We have some minutes for questions. Just let me give you two quotes from C.S. Lewis' Miracles, which I think so beautifully talks about not only the fact of the miracles, that God has acted in Jesus Christ, but he talks about the significance of the miracles. Each miracle writes for us in small letters something that God has already written or will write in letters almost too large to be noticed across the whole canvas of nature. They focus at a particular point either God's actual or his future operations on the universe. So the miracles gives us a picture of what God is intended to do with this universe. And I find it so interesting that when Jesus is doing miracles in the Gospels, he is not putting on a power show to impress people. He's always restoring human life to its original potential before sin, showing us a picture of what life will be in the kingdom. So he restores people to God. He forgives sins. He heals people from sickness. He includes the outcasts. And he raises people from dead. All his miracles have this function of a sign what God wants with this creation. Now this creation is distorted by sin. And we know it and we cry out, why is it like this? And we understand it shouldn't be like this. All the things that cripples the human existence. And then the miracles Jesus is doing is always restoring life back to what it originally was meant to be. And nature is not a threat any longer, so he calms the sea. People are not to hunger in their inner being or physically. And Lewis says about the greatest of miracles, the resurrection. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation, a new chapter in cosmic history. has opened. That's so beautifully framed. The resurrection is not just an odd event, an unexpected, a dead man comes to life. It is an event with enormous significance of opening a door that has been locked since the fall and given a new possibility for everyone who receives Jesus to be part of a new creation where death is no more.